Oke, ya, terima kasih atas kehadirannya. Oke. But before that, maybe we want to waiting for another participant. Maybe Professor Justin will. I please you to wait a moment ya. For this discussion. Kami tunggu sekitar 2 menit ya Pak Huda ya untuk partisipan agar ikut di diskusi kali ini.
Oke.
Okay, thank you. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Good afternoon, everyone. Great to see you all, and let me introduce myself to you. My name is Rina Mutahara. I'm a moderator for our discussion today. And in this opportunity, we have Professor Justin and Pak Nur Huda will deliver and discuss about contagion in Islamic thought. But before that, let me remind you all, before the end of discussion, we have Q&A section. So if you all have any question, or maybe you want to ask some question for Professor Justin or maybe kepada Pak Nur Huda, please prepare yourself, prepare your question, and let's jump to the discussion. Okay. Halo Pak. Ya. Bagaimana kabarnya Pak Huda, sehat nih?
Alhamdulillah. Good afternoon, Mr. Justin.
Okay, thank you, ladies and gentlemen. As we know that during the past 3 years, we experienced a nightmare. Almost every single area in this world experienced lockdown. Almost 2 years, like that, and because COVID-19 pandemic. This pandemic affect misery in every single aspect in our life, especially in health, education, politics, economic, and in religion. And this also lead to how people assume and think about this pandemic in various ways, such as in politics, economic, health, and religion, and also maybe in conspiration like that. So, including how Islam see about this pandemic. And today we are going to discuss about contagion in Islamic thought. We have Prof. Justin and Pak Nur Huda here. And I believe this discussion will be very, very interesting. Pak Nur Huda will introducing our discussion today. Pak Nur Huda nanti panjenengan diminta untuk memberikan pengantar terhadap diskusi ini sekitar 20 menit. It's about 20 minutes. And after Pak Nur Huda, we get the main speaker, that's Mr. Justin. Professor Justin will give us a lecture about Islamic thought in in uh, in in pandemic like that. So I believe you are will be ready and prepare your book, your pen to note all of the lecture from our speaker today. For the first, we have Pak Huda as the introduction of this discussion. Kepada Pak Huda, monggo waktunya persilahkan.
Terima kasih. PPT-nya sudah Mbak Mutahara?
Sampun Mbak, nanti saya siapkan.
Monggo ya. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Because my English is not so good, I'm sorry. I will presenting my PPT with Indonesian. I'm sorry. Rekan-rekan saya hormati, Mas Cak Latif ya, sebagai Ketua Program Studi Sejarah Peradaban Islam, Mbak Martina, dan para peserta yang lain. Kali ini saya ingin mengantarkan diskusi ini, saya ingin melihat dari sisi kajian Islam ya. Kajian Islam dalam pengertian yang sangat luas, bagaimana Islam didekati dengan pendekatan sejarah. Ini mungkin sesuai dengan kajian Mr. Justin ya tentang wabah itu sendiri atau contagion itu. Lanjut Mbak. Mungkin slide kedua Mbak, slide kedua.
Ini Mbak, sebentar. Sepertinya ini ada sedikit trouble.
Oke. Kita tahu bahwa Islam merupakan agama dakwah. Oleh karena setiap orang, setiap umat Islam mempunyai kewajiban moral untuk menampilkan itu. Islam hadir tentu saja sesuai dengan norma-normanya, yaitu mempunyai sebagai pedoman hidup yang menjadikan keluasan materi serta kedalaman ajaran. Misi utamanya adalah rahmatan lil alamin, ya, tidak terkecuali. Jadi misi Islam yang utama adalah bagaimana membawa kerahmatan, membawa kebaikan bagi seluruh alam. Oleh karena itu ajaran Islam harus mampu memberi kontribusi bagi pemecahan masalah-masalah yang dihadapi oleh manusia. Oleh karena Islam dikatakan sebagai agama yang selalu sesuai dengan masa, waktu, dan tempatnya. Likuli zaman wal makan, ya, gitu. Itulah konsep Islam sesungguhnya. Slide selanjutnya, Mbak.
Minimal apa? Minimal ke maksimal. Suaramu sangat.
Slide selanjutnya. Jadi ini harus diwujudkan di dalam kehidupan. Bagaimana Islam itu harus sesuai dengan masa, sesuai dengan waktu dan tempatnya. Nah, menurut Kuntowijo ya, ini Kuntowijo seorang sejarawan dari UGM, Gajah Mada, mengatakan bahwa Islam mempunyai dua bagian, yaitu struktur dalam, deep structure, and struktur permukaan luar atau surface structure. Itu Islam bagi dalam diri. Deep structure bentuk akidah, akhlak, ibadah, syariat, dan muamalah. Surface structure dapat diamat dalam ibadah sholat, puasa, saum, zakat, haji, moral, etika, perilaku sehari-hari. Akidah, akhlak, ibadah, dan syariat bersifat immutable, tidak berubah dari waktu ke waktu dan dari tempat ke tempat lain. Inilah disebut dengan aspek normativitas. Ya, itulah Islam dari aspek normatif tidak bisa berubah. Muamalah itu yang dapat berubah, itu demikian Tawijoyo. Karena itu transformasi dalam Islam yang sudah utuh harus diartikan sebagai transformasi dalam bidang muamalah, bukan dalam bidang yang lain. Inilah disebut dengan aspek historisitas, historicity in Islam. Selanjutnya, Mbak. Nah, ini saya kira bagian ini bisa di teks Al-Qur'an hadis itu sebagai apa apa namanya tadi? Sebentar. Di atas cuma jadi itulah yang permukaan yang terdalam ya, sedangkan di yang di bagian bawah misalnya ijtihad, istinbat ulama, itu termasuk surface surface structure. Teks Al-Quran hadis adalah deep structure in Islam. Itu bisa menjadi gambaran ya. Selanjutnya Mbak. Nah, ini oleh karena dalam mengkaji Islam ada dua pendekatan, yaitu aspek normativitas dan historisitas. Pakai apa itu kajian Islam? Secara ekonomi kajian adalah merupakan terjemahan dari surat Dirasatul Islamiyah dalam bahasa Arab atau Islam Studies in English ya. Jadi sebetulnya adalah kajian mengenai hal-hal yang berkaitan dengan Islam. Secara epistemologis, kajian atau studi Islam adalah usaha sadar dan sistematis untuk mengetahui, memahami, dan membahas secara mendalam tentang hal-hal yang berhubungan dengan agama Islam, baik yang berkaitan dengan ajaran, sejarah, maupun praktek-praktek pelaksanaan secara nyata dalam kehidupan sehari-hari sepanjang sejarahnya. Itu yang disebut dengan kajian Islam. Jadi di dalam mengkaji Islam ada pendekatan historis, ada pendekatan normatif. Itu. Jadi mungkin yang dikaji oleh semacam Pak Yasin Stearns adalah berkaitan dengan aspek-aspek historitas dalam Islam itu sendiri. Ya, Mbak. Nah, studi Islam merupakan kajian agama Islam tentang aspek-aspek Islam, masyarakat, dan budaya Islam. Atas dasar pembedaan tersebut, diidentifikasi 3 pola kerja yang masuk dalam lingkup kajian Islam. Yang pertama adalah kajian normatif agama Islam yang dikembangkan oleh sarjana Muslim untuk memperoleh pengetahuan atas dasar kebenaran keagamaan Islam. Kajian ini ya, banyak berkembang di masjid, madrasah, dan berbagai lembaga pendidikan Islam lainnya. Jadi di sini hanya untuk mencari dalil-dalil penguat ya, sebagai bahan untuk pengajian dan sebagainya, tapi tidak jarang rangka untuk mencari kebenaran itu sendiri, tapi untuk memperkuat keimanan itu saja ya. Jadi itu kajian normatif adalah teman-teman dalil sarjana untuk memperoleh pengetahuan bagaimana pengetahuan Islam itu dalam rangka untuk membenahi atau meningkatkan kualitas keimanan dalam pemeluk Islam itu sendiri. Terus yang kedua, kajian normatif agama Islam. Biasanya kajian dalam jenis ini dilakukan di Universitas dalam bentuk penggalian lebih mendalam dari suatu ajaran Islam. Nah, tentu saja ini lebih akademis, nah, dalam rangka untuk mencari kebenaran itu sendiri secara keilmuan, bukan atas dasar pada pengetahuan keimanan yang itu saya kira itu hanya untuk mandek ya, bukan untuk pengembangan lebih lanjut. Yang selanjutnya, Mbak. Ketika kajian normatif atas berbagai aspek Keislaman yang berkaitan dengan culture dan masyarakat Muslim dalam lingkup yang lebih luas, kajiannya tidak secara terkait dengan Islam sebagai sebuah norma. Nah, menurut Charles D. Adams, hal mendasar yang penting dipahami dalam studi Islam adalah definisi Islam dan agama. Jadi Adams itu membedakan antara Islam dan agama. As Islam and religion itu is different. Demikian menurut Charles D. Adams ya. Di sini Islam dilihat dari perspektif sejarah sebagai sesuatu yang selalu berubah dan terus berkembang dari generasi ke generasi dalam respon secara mendalam realitas dan makna kehidupan ini. Sementara itu, konsep agama memiliki 2 aspek, yaitu pengalaman dan perilaku luar manusia itu sendiri. Jadi inilah yang barangkali yang lebih ditekan pada kajian-kajian yang dilakukan oleh Stearns dalam buku-bukunya atau artikel-artikel tentang wabah itu sendiri. Ya, selanjutnya, Mbak. Nah, historisitas Islam, pengetahuan sejarah memiliki kedudukan penting dalam sejarah. Maksud saya ini salah ini. Pengetahuan memiliki pengetahuan tentang Islam ya, maksudnya memiliki kedudukan dalam sejarah. Sejarah merupakan pisau analisis terbaik dalam memahami Islam. Ini menurut Profesor Nur Zaman yang pernah saya disampaikan pada saya bahwa sejarah merupakan pisau alat yang terbaik dalam memahami kajian Islam itu sendiri. W.C. Smith mengatakan bahwa sejarah adalah lebih signifikan bagi Muslim dibandingkan kelompok-kelompok agama lain. Inilah Islam ternyata sangat mementingkan aspek historis. Tujuannya apa? Ini paling penting hal ini didasarkan pada pentingnya dalam Islam berumur pada lahirnya para sejarawan Muslim seperti Muhammad Ibnu Jarir at-Tabari, ya, yang dikatakan sebagai bapak sejarah Islam, dan Abdurrahman Ibnu Muhammad Ibnu Khaldun sebagai bapak filsafat sejarah Islam itu sendiri. Inilah pentingnya sejarah. Maka di dalam historiografi Islam, sejarah mengalami perkembangan yang luar biasa. Maka muncullah tokoh-tokoh sejarawan seperti Muhammad Ibn Jarir at-Tabari dan Muhammad Ibnu Khaldun itu sendiri di dalam historiografi Islam. Selanjutnya, Mbak. Setidaknya ada 4 genre lahirnya historiografi Islam ya. Yang pertama memang ya berkaitan dengan keimanan, yaitu kewajiban muslimin untuk meneladani Rasulullah SAW. Ini salah satu faktor mengapa Islam atau di dunia Islam itu sejarah mengalami perkembangan yang cukup pesat. Yang kedua, sebagai alat untuk menafsirkan dan memahami maksud ayat Al-Quran, asbabun nuzul dan hadis. Jadi bagaimanapun Islam, kita dalam memahami Islam tidak bisa melepaskan dari kesejarahan itu sendiri. Karena di dalam Al-Quran, di dalam ulumul Quran misalnya, untuk dapat memahami Al-Quran secara baik, tidak hanya tekstual, tapi perlu kontekstual itu sendiri. Dan kontekstual itu tentu saja memerlukan kita memahami tentang mengapa ayat itu turun, yang disebut dengan nanti asbabun nuzul di dalam Al-Quran itu sendiri. Begitu juga dengan hadis ya. Di dalam ulumul hadis terdapat namanya asbabul wurud. Mengapa sebuah hadis itu lahir atau muncul? Di sini perlu ilmu sejarah itu sendiri dalam rangka untuk memfasilitasi hadis itu sendiri. Yang ketiga ya, mengapa yang mendorong lahirnya yang ketiga adalah sebagai alat ukur kesahihan atau validitas hasanat suatu hadis. Jadi inilah umat Islam sebetulnya dididik untuk menjadi seorang yang kritis ya, tidak serta-merta menerima informasi baik itu hadis maupun pandangan-pandangan keislaman yang lain. Karena kita di sinilah di dalam sejarah ada ini kan, kalau di dalam ilmu sejarah kan ada namanya yang disebut dengan kritik sumber ya. Di hadis ini pun kita sejarah digunakan untuk menentukan kesahihan atau validasi sanad suatu hadis sendiri. Yang keempat adalah untuk merekam peristiwa-peristiwa penting baik sebelum maupun sudah kedatangan Islam. Jadi ini saya kira hal-hal semacam ini digunakan untuk bagaimana menentukan suatu aspek hukum itu sendiri. Nah, pada perkara selanjutnya ya, historitas Islam dapat menumbuhkan Islam dalam masyarakat Islam sendiri. Kesadaran sejarah akan membangun sadar kebesaran jiwa umat Islam dalam bentuk antara lain moderasi dan toleransi beragama sebagai salah satu prasyarat terbentuknya ukhuwah Islamiyah. Jadi ketika umat Islam itu memahami sejarah atau kesadaran cukup tinggi, tentu saja secara tidak langsung ini menimbulkan akan terbentuk sikap moderat ya, toleransi terhadap paham-paham agama itu sendiri. Dan disinilah nanti ungkapan hadis bahwa ikhtilafu ummati rahmatun misalnya, bahwa perbedaan di dalam umatku adalah menjadi rahmat. Ini pentingnya sejarah, sehingga hal semacam ini bisa membentuk kebesaran jiwa bagi umat Islam yang di sana tentu saja beragam mazhab atau aliran yang tidak bisa dilepaskan dari perkembangan agama itu sendiri. Nah, ini alasannya mereka memperubahan dan perkembangan Islam dari masa ke masa yang berubah. Pada kedua, pemahaman keragaman pemikiran dan pandangan dalam komunitas Islam yang salah satunya disebabkan oleh faktor-faktor eksternal. Jadi dengan kesadaran semacam itu, bagaimana perkembangan Islam itu mengalami perubahan dan perkembangan. Nah, perkembangan inilah yang nanti menimbulkan keragaman berpikir, pandangan, mazhab-mazhab, aliran-aliran dan sebagainya. Yang itu tentu saja disebabkan oleh banyak faktor eksternal, termasuk dalam hal misalnya ijtihad dan sebagainya. Nah, ini perbedaan merupakan suatu rahmat yang berpengaruh positif bagi tumbuhnya kreativitas peradaban di dunia Muslim. Jadi di sini dengan adanya kesadaran sejarah seperti ini, perbedaan merupakan modal positif bagi perkembangnya atau tumbuhnya peradaban Islam itu sendiri. Kita bisa membayangkan kalau umat Islam hanya satu pemikiran, tentu saja akan mengalami stagnasi. Inilah barangkali sisi positif dari perbedaan-perbedaan yang ada itu, bahwa dengan perbedaan itu bisa menimbulkan munculnya peradaban di dunia Islam itu sendiri. Ya inilah tentu saja yang harus kita pelihara ya. Selanjutnya Mbak.
Oke. Jangan masih ada waktu 5 menit ya Pak untuk
ya Mbak, nanti sebentar. Oke. Nah, ini bagaimana sudut pandang historis dan normatif untuk melihat tulisan Justin Stearns ya tentang contagion, tentang wabah menular ya. Ini dia tulisan-tulisannya bagaimana respon umat Islam terhadap wabah ya, wabah yang disebut dengan Black Death itu yang muncul di pada tahun berapa ini? Sekitar tahun abad ke-14 itu. Ini ternyata menimbulkan reaksi yang luar biasa baik dari orang-orang Kristen, orang-orang Islam, dan orang Yahudi sendiri bagaimana menghadapi ini. Ternyata di sana banyak perbedaan ya dalam menanggapi ini. Mereka ini kan berselisih pendapat dengan alasan agama semua, tentu saja. Para pemimpin agama pada umumnya ada berpendapat bahwa ketika terjadi wabah misalnya, bahwa mereka harus mengisolasi diri atau mengasingkan diri. Tetapi ada pendapat lain. Ini kalau Anda mengasingkan diri atau mengisolasi diri, ini melawan takdir Tuhan. Demikian kelompok-kelompok fatalis ya, semasa ini kelompok-kelompok Jabariyah kalau dalam Islam itu. Ini mereka seperti itu. Dan semua ini ternyata kembali kepada nas-nas agama itu sendiri. Semacam kalau Islam ya ke nas Al-Quran atau nas hadis dan sebagainya itu. Inilah yang didebatkan oleh bagaimana tulisan-tulisan dari Justin Stearns tentang Black Death. Dan ini tentu saja kan bagaimana kita melihat kelompok-kelompok agama itu berbeda pendapat dalam menghadapi atau mensikapi COVID-19 kemarin ya. Itu. Jadi yang disebut misalnya ini peristiwa tersebut telah muncul perdebatan di kalangan ulama Islam dan agama-agama lainnya semacam Yahudi dan Kristen. Mereka terpolarisasi dalam dua kelompok, yaitu kelompok yang mengenai teologis dan etis, kan begitu sih jadi seperti itu. Jadi ada kelompok. Yang disebut kedua berpendapat bahwa seseorang harus melakukan diri dari orang yang kena wabah untuk mencegah penularan penyakit lebih lanjut. Ini kan Justin mencontohkan sikap Umar ya, ketika dia melakukan kunjungan ke Syria misalnya, ada informasi bahwa di Syria ada wabah yang menyerang. Oleh karena disarankan agar Umar kembali. Tapi Umar mendengarkan masukan ini, tetapi mendapat reaksi. Apa kata Umar? Saya menghindari takdir, tapi masih takdir yang lain begitu. Ini saya kira yang disebutkan oleh buku-buku tulisan-tulisan Justin Stearns tentang wabah menular atau contagion itu. Selanjutnya Mbak, karena waktunya mau habis. Nah, ini saya kira inilah yang di dalam buku tersebut misalnya ya paling tidak ada beberapa tulisan Justin Stearns yaitu dengan contagion and response para pemimpin agama lihat dalam infectious ideas contagion in pre-modern Islam. Ini satu kajian Justin bagaimana dia merekam para pemimpin agama termasuk Kristen dan Islam menghadapi problem seperti itu. Tetapi sebelumnya Justin juga menulis tentang ini di dalam buku tersebut saya mengeksplorasi lebih luas mengenai Black Death yang ada di Afrika Utara, Maghrib dan sekitarnya, dan tanggapan beragama, ulama, pendeta atau pastor di dalamnya ya. Sebagai kajian sejarah intelektual Islam, buku tersebut mengajar pada sumber-sumber sejarah berbahasa Arab. Ini saya kira kelebihan dari bukunya Justin ya, yang mempunyai referensi terhadap sumber-sumber Arab otoritatif ya, untuk ketika dia berbicara tentang Islam. Begitu ketika berbicara dengan pendapat orang-orang Kristen, dia merujuk pada sumber-sumber buku-buku berasal Latin. Itu dapat bertahu secara ilmiah. Ya, selanjutnya Mbak. Nah, ini dari buku itu didalil oleh beberapa artikel Stearns yang sebelumnya dianggap sebagai Contagion in Theology and Law. Ya, jadi bagaimana Contagion itu di dalam dilihat dari sisi teologis dan hukum itu sendiri, dia Justin ini menulis tentang dua ulama di Grenada pada abad 14 itu bagaimana menanggapi, yaitu beri contoh kasus Ibnu Lub dan Ibnu Khatib, kan begitu ya. Kedua ini meskipun mempunyai hubungan guru dan murid, tetapi yang perbedaan. Ibnu Lub lebih cenderung ke fatalistik ya, sedangkan Ibnu Khatib cenderung ke etis. Jadi dia lebih berpendapat bahwa ketika terjadi wabah, sebaiknya memang perlu mengasingkan diri atau menjauhkan diri dari orang-orang terkena penyakit itu dalam rangka untuk mencegah penularan itu sendiri. Nah ini kedua ulama yang berhubungan tersebut ya, wabah maut dan meninggal pada waktu selesai, tidak hanya mengupas pemikiran kedua tokoh tersebut, tapi menelisik lebih lanjut latar belakang kemunculan. Inilah intelektual genealogi yang ditelisik oleh Justin sebagai seorang pakar sejarah intelektual. Mengapa Ibnu Khatib, Ibnu Lub mempunyai pemikiran-pemikiran yang berbeda seperti itu? Inilah letak historisnya di dalam kajian-kajian Justin Stearns itu. Selanjutnya Mbak, ini yang terakhir barangkali. Nah, ini ya. Nah, dalam artikel 2 Stearns mencoba melakukan kajian perbandingan di antara pemimpin agama Yahudi Kristen. Jadi di dalam tadi ini mau kemana sih kajian seperti ini misalnya? Dia memberi contoh kajian terhadap bagaimana respon para rabi Yahudi, para pendeta Kristen dan Islam itu dalam menghadapi Black Death atau maut hitam itu ya. Hasilnya pada ketiga agama ternyata antara Islam, Yahudi, Kristen itu memiliki kesamaan ya. Mereka para pemimpin agama ada yang bahwa itu kan sebuah takdir. Kelompok-kelompok fatalis itu takdir tidak bisa terhindarkan. Sedangkan kelompok-kelompok rasionalis barangkali itu lebih harus bisa dicegah dengan cara mengasingkan diri atau mengisolasi diri. Nah inilah karena kedua tersebut memiliki prediksi. Nah jadi yang kedua, Justin coba memprediksi ya, kajian-kajiannya sebagai prediksi sejarah terhadap kajian tentang sejarah dengan topik Contagion pada masa-masa yang akan datang. Nah menurut saya kajian sangat ini penting ya pada masa yang akan datang. Ini saya setuju dengan karena bagaimana betulnya wabah-wabah seperti selalu berulang. Oleh karena itu saya kira para pengkaji atau pengambil kebijakan perlu belajar banyak dari sejarah masa lalu itu bagaimana mengantisipasi penyakit-penyakit menular seperti ini yang semacam kasus COVID-19 ya, tentu saja mereka perlu belajar atau membaca banyak buku kajian Justin Stearns ini dalam mengambil sikap atau kebijakan-kebijakan tertentu. Lanjutkan, Mbak. Nah, ini dari sisi sejarah legislasi hukum Islam sebetulnya dalam tarikh tasrik di dalam Islam tadi kan ada namanya tarikh tasrik atau sejarah hukum. Sebetulnya topik kajian seperti ini kan sesuatu yang baru ya, karena di sana kan bagaimana dalam sejarah hukum itu kan umat Islam merumuskan hukum itu kan nanti berdasar pada Al-Qur'an, ada hadis, ada qiyas ya, ada istimbat, ada satu jara'i, ada dan sebagainya. Itu memerlukan kajian-kajian historis yang luar biasa. Ya, dalam tarikh tasrik misalnya dibahas proses pembentukan hukum. Jadi dalam penentuan hukum ini saya kira ketampaknya kajian Justin mengambil topik-topik tarikh tasrik seperti ini ya. Dalam tasrik kita mau bahwa latar belakang kehidupan. Nah, ini dalam penentuan hukum ternyata ideologi politik ya atau pandangan worldview dari mustahid atau ulama itu sangat mempengaruhi dalam menentukan sebuah hukum itu sendiri. Jadi oleh karena itu dalam penentuan terjadi perbedaan. Ideologi mazhab itu sangat berpengaruh ya. Misalnya kelompok fatalistis, misalnya Jabariyah itu ya sudah. Tapi untuk kelompok Mu'tazilah misalnya itu lebih kreatif dalam menanggapi masalah-masalah seperti ini. Dia tidak bersandar pada wahyu, tapi wahyu harus dijelaskan lebih lanjut secara rasional begitu. Ya, ini saya kira kajian secara dalam historiografi, kajian yang dilakukan oleh Justin merupakan topik yang kajian yang masih sangat langka ya. Oleh karena ini saya kira kajian-kajian historiografi Islam pada umumnya lebih masih bersifat konvensional, yaitu lebih aspek-aspek politik lebih diutamakan, lebih dominan daripada kajian-kajian semacam sejarah sosial intelektual semacam Justin ini. Nah, oleh karena itu saya kira tulisan Justin bisa menginspirasi kita bagaimana melihat sejarah yang bisa tidak hanya berguna bagi sejarah itu sendiri, tapi semua akademis yang lain termasuk kedokteran, pengambil kebijakan dan sebagainya. Itu saya kira ya tanggapan saya tentang buku karya-karya Justin yang disebut pada sore hari ini. Terima kasih. Ada kurang saya mohon maaf. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Terima kasih banyak Pak Nur. That is very interesting introduction. And I believe we are looking forward to dig deeper about this theme with the main speaker, that's Professor Justin, and help me to welcome Professor Justin, and this precious time is yours. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I'm quite honored to be invited to speak today, and thank you very much to Dr. Nur Hada for his introduction. I wish I understood more of it, but I think I got some of it. So thank you very much for that, and thank you also to Reza Hakim for reaching out to me initially over email and for putting us in touch. So I think that after this introduction, which I think already framed the issue quite well. From what I understood from a few of the words, I'm now going to lay out some of my broader thinking on the subject of contagion and infectious disease in the Islamic tradition. And then I look forward to a conversation that we can have. So today, I think during the era of COVID, we all understand why contagion and infection are interesting and important phenomena for society at large and for, human beings around the world, but also within the realm of religion. How do we respond to disease? And so one of and to infection, to the danger of disease, especially when this is the center of religious activity is being together, is worshiping together. And infection is obviously difficult. So let me return and talk a little bit about how I first became interested in this idea and in contagion within Islam, and then we can explore some of the questions that this poses. So my initial interest in contagion came from the phenomenon of the Black Death of the 14th century. And I was looking here at Al-Andalus, which is in the Islamic West in what is today southern Spain, and the phenomenon that in the 14th century with the Black Death, roughly 50% of the population of the Mediterranean was killed. And so I know today COVID is terrible, but imagine how much worse this would be if 50% of everyone you knew around you died. And in Al-Andalus, or Islamic Spain, right next to each other, we had Jews, Christians, and Muslims living in the same area, experiencing the same natural disaster. And so they interpret this disaster differently, and how did they respond to it differently based upon their religious traditions, right? And this then poses the question of what is similar between these religious faiths and what is different in terms of what different traditions do they have to rely upon. Now, when we ask questions like this, looking at religious traditions and how they respond to disease in the past, we are in danger of getting involved in some very modern conversations. The modern conversations can at times are defensive or apologetic, meaning that some people say, well, Christians had the better response, or Muslims had the better response, or Jews had the better response, or Christians understood medicine then better than the same way we do today, or Muslims knew about contagion before everybody else. These are not very interesting questions to me. I don't think they are good questions, but they are questions that come about in any case, right? And so we can talk about that a little bit. But what I'm more interested in here is to understand how people at that time understood disease and what tools they drew upon. And some of those tools were medical. And what is striking for us is so I'm going to go back and talk a little bit about the early Muslim community and how the early Muslim community came to understand disease. And then I will talk about the scriptural sources. That is to say, mostly about the hadith when it comes to the question of contagion. So Islam emerged into the Mediterranean area in roughly the 7th century after the Prophet Muhammad's mission and his passing away in 632. Prophet Muhammad never left Arabia, but the early Muslim community did very soon leave Arabia and moved into a broader Middle East, which had the previous monotheisms of Christianity and Judaism. It also had an understanding of medicine that was Hellenic, meaning it came from Greek medicine. And the Hellenic understanding of health and medicine was based on every human being being composed of 4 humors. That is to say, you have bile, you have phlegm, you have blood and phlegm. Those are the 4 humors. And depending upon their composition within you, that is health. Disease is when there is an imbalance in the humors. And so doctors would look at someone and they would say, this is why you are sick. We have to bring the humors back into order. This was medical theory for about 1,000 years, which was widely accepted. It was widely accepted by the Greeks, and then by the early Hellenized Christians and Jews, and then by Muslims as well. So in terms of medicine and science, so to speak, they were all using the same basic model, which is that health is a composition of the humors. And so if you have to explain how a lot of people can get sick at the same time, you have to look for a cause that can make everyone sick at the same time. And most people at that time thought that was air. So epidemics, pandemics come about when the air is corrupted, when the air becomes bad. And then everybody who's in the same area inhales the same air, and then they become sick. So that is what people were thinking of when they went to doctors, right? But there were some other things as well. What Jews, Christians, and Muslims had in common was a belief in an omnipotent God, right? Still today, this is what they believe. There's one God who is omnipotent. What is the function of disease then for God? Why do we have disease? What impact does that make upon people, right? And there's a couple of different answers that are similar for all of the Abrahamic faiths. One of them, though, is that disease is a good thing because it causes you to turn towards God, to realize that this world is very short and that the afterlife is very long. And therefore that disease is an opportunity to become more religious and to turn yourself towards God and to entrust yourself to God. So that is something they all have in common. But what is different about Islam? The main thing that distinguishes Islam from Christianity and Judaism is that the early Muslim community had an experience of a pandemic, not the Prophet himself. In most of the hadith related to contagion that regard the Prophet himself, it goes back to his experience with lepers and the notion of whether you can eat meals with lepers or not. And the Prophet had a few different hadith regarding this. Some he says that you should not eat with lepers. Some he does eat himself with lepers. He famously says, "Fir min al-majzoom firarak min al-asad," to run away from a leper as if he were a lion, right? So there are these things. But the early Muslim community, after the Prophet passed away in 632, the early Muslim community expanded outwards and came into what is today Lebanon, Syria, Israel, Palestine, this area, where they were fighting against the Byzantines. And in that area, they encountered the plague, and many Muslims died of the plague. And so there were also a lot of traditions which go back to that event. And one of those is the case of the Caliph Omar at a place called Sa'd in southern Syria. And Omar came with an army of Muslims, and they heard that the plague had broken out in Syria. And so Omar brought everyone around him and said, do we go ahead or do we go back? And some of the Muslims said we should go ahead. Some of the ones we said they should go back. Some, and Omar looked like he wanted to go back to Medina to go away from the plague. And other people came to him and said, are you running away from Qadr Allah? Are you going away from what God has decreed? And Omar said, afar min qadar Allah illa qadar Allah. I am going from God, what God has decreed, to what God has decreed, which was, I think we can all admit, a very smart way of saying it. But then someone, Amr ibn Abdurrahman ibn al-Auf, he came and he said, look, I remember what the Prophet said. And the Prophet said that if you hear of the plague breaking out, you do not leave that place. And if you are outside that place, you do not enter that place. And so Omar said, okay, Alhamdulillah, let's go back. Let's go back to Medina. So this was a very important hadith at the moment. And people today have been talking about this hadith a lot during Corona, because it can be used to justify and to think about quarantine and things like this. But there were other hadith as well. One of the most interesting things about this time period is the early Muslim community considered dying of the plague to be a martyrdom, right? So we have examples, and Mu'adh bin Jabal, a prophetic companion, said, please, he said that, may I die of the plague, may I become a martyr. And he did die of the plague, and he was considered a martyr. And so there is also the notion at this time period, and this is because many of the Muslims who died at this period of the plague, they were on jihad. They were going out to do jihad and to spread the word of Islam. And so if they died during that process, you know, obviously they would be considered martyrs. And so if they died of plague in that process, then they were also considered to be martyrs. And so this was it. So we think of this now. Let's think of a couple of things. So we have the notion that the dying of the plague is a martyrdom. We know at the same time that you should not approach the plague. We know that you can eat with lepers, but you have to run away with lepers. And then the Prophet most famously said, perhaps, La adwa wa la tiyarata wa la hamata wa la ghula. There is no contagion, there is no evil omen, there is no ghoul, there is no these other things. So some people were confused because there were hadith over here that says this, and there were hadith over here that says this. And there were some Muslims who, these were Mu'tazilis, who actually cited these hadith. And they said, there's a problem with the hadith. But there were some very strong defenders of the hadith. And so we find early on in the 3rd century, Ibn Qutayba in his book, Ta'wil Mukhtalif al-Hadith, he comes in and says, okay, I'm going to explain this to you. I'm going to explain why the Prophet says different things about these different things. And he says, the La Adwa hadith, this means that the Prophet said that diseases do not transmit themselves by themselves. They transmit themselves, يعني بمشيئة الله, بإذن الله. They transmit themselves with the permission of God or by the means of God himself, right? They are the occasion, they are the asbab, but they are not the means. It's a little complicated. I'll get to that in a second when we talk about occasionalism. The larger important thing to think about here, though, is that early Islam had a rich collection of hadith and about contagious disease, which early Christianity did not, and early Judaism did not. And so the idea of disease and contagion has much more material at this early period than these other religions. Okay. As the plague ended in roughly 750 in the Abbasid Empire, as far as we know, people began to write treatises, medical manuals. This is people like Ibn Sahel Raban al-Tabari, Qusta ibn Luqa, Muhammad al-Razi, Ibn Sina. All of them have diseases that they consider to be contagious, right? And we also then have subsequently theologians in Islam who take up some of the central problems that contagious disease poses, right? Now, this is where we come to a term basically called theodicy. Theodicy is, why do bad things happen to good people, or the problem of evil? And so you may ask yourself, if you have people who are good Muslims, who are believers, who are acting well, why does God bring a disease that kills them? This is a problem, right? Why does that happen? And on the one hand, we know that if you die of the plague, for example, that you can be a martyr. Okay, so that's good. But then what can you do about medicine? If God is all-powerful, do you have the right to use medicine to heal yourself? So Muslim theologians were ready for this. They have you covered, no worries. And for example, Al-Ghazali, in his Ihya Ulum al-Din, a very famous Muslim theologian from the 10th and 11th century, he says, look, the situation is like this. If you are going to have a house, don't you lock the door at night to stop people from coming in? They're thieves. If you are going to go into battle, don't you carry a shield? If you are going to have your camel, most of us don't have camels now, but Al-Ghazali used this example. If you are going to have your camel, you tie the camel up before you go and pray so that the camel doesn't run away, right? And if you are going to be afraid of being sick, you use medicine. What all of these are things that God has given you in his wisdom. And so it is responsible for the believer to use these means, right? That's responsible. This is the wisdom of God, hikmat Allah, that you need to make aware of God and also of God's ada, of his habit, of how God acts in the natural world. So it's responsible for the believer. Just because God is all-powerful does not mean that you can just sit back and do nothing. You have to take the responsibility to understand God's wisdom in the world and to make use of it. So this is what Ghazali said. You can use medicine, you can protect yourself from an infectious disease, and God makes infections happen. Diseases don't do that by themselves. That is the hikmat Allah. That is God's wisdom of how it works, okay? So for a while, people were not thinking as much about contagious disease. There was no plague from the 8th century until the 14th century, so 600 years of roughly no plague. Other infectious diseases like leprosy were present, but people weren't writing about them a lot. But with the 14th century and the Black Death that comes over the whole Muslim world and kills between 30 to 50% of the population, Muslims start talking about contagion and infectious disease a lot. And they start a new thing. They start something called a plague treatise. They're going to write a treatise and tell you how to behave during a time of disease and during a time of plague. And in these treatises, they take from the hadith, they take from the medical traditions of Ibn Sina and other people from the books like this, and they take from hadith commentaries, and they also take from the fatwa literature, from the legal decisions, right? I saw that Dr. Noor, he spoke about an article I wrote comparing Ibn al-Khatib and Ibn Lub. These were two jurists who lived in Granada at the same time. Ibn Lub said, there is no contagion and you need to protect your fellow believers. So be close to them in times of disease and help them. Ibn al-Khatib said, I see the evidence with my own eyes. Disease transmits itself. And so we have to take care to protect the Muslim ummah, to protect the Muslim community, and to interpret the hadith according to what we see. Okay, so why is that interesting? It shows us that two Muslim ulama, two of the ulama, are both reading the scriptural sources, and they're saying completely different things. So they're saying two different things entirely. Because, and I heard Dr. Noor cited إنما الاختلاف في أمتي رحمة. So the difference between them is a mercy, as the Prophet would say. But there's some interesting things here. You may say today, well, I know that plague is contagious. I know it's contagious. And so Ibn al-Khatib is right. He is rational. And Ibn Lub is wrong. Well, I mean, I agree with you. The plague is kind of contagious, right? I mean, it's actually not contagious. It infects. It comes from a little flea that bites you and then it has to jump from one person onto the next. This is the whole Yersinia pestis business. But let's just stop for a moment before you get to be too mean to Ibn Lub and too supportive of Ibn al-Khatib and reflect upon the empiricism here. If you were in the 14th century and you were looking and watching people and the plague comes, one whole house, everybody might die. In the next house, nobody dies. In the next house, one person dies. And you're like, but if it's contagious, why is this happening? This is empiricism. You're looking, you're taking the empirical evidence in, and you're trying to reconcile that. So, for example, in the 15th century, Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani, a very important scholar, writes a book called Badl al-Ma'un fi Fadl al-Ta'un, very influential plague treatise. And in this, he says, the plague is not contagious. It's not contagious because I have seen with my own eyes that people in one house get sick and people in another house do not get sick. So he writes this plague treatise. Ibn al-Khatib, at the other end of the Mediterranean, writes his plague treatise and says, it's contagious, and whatever you do, don't go close to it. Do not buy. And he has a friend named Ibn Khatima who also writes, or Khatima, Ibn Khatima, who also writes a plague treatise in which he says, don't buy the clothes in the market. When people die, don't buy the old clothes because you'll get sick from those. You have another scholar, Al-Bidlisi, who in the early 16th century, who writes a plague treatise. He writes this, he's a Kurdish scholar, and he writes this when he's on Hajj, coming back from Mecca to Anatolia. And he says the plague is absolutely contagious, and the Ottoman Caliph should protect people by protecting them from the plague. So the scholars, there was ihtilaf, there was ihtilaf between the scholars on this issue. And I think this is actually something important. Dr. Noor, if I understood correctly, was talking about deep structure and surface structure, right? So all of the scholars, this is kind of are interacting with the sources. They're going to the Quran, they're going to the Hadith, they're going to what they see, their empirical evidence, what they see with their eyes, but they are interpreting it differently. They're interpreting it differently. All of them all of them want to show that there is a connection here between medicine and between faith, that there is a responsibility for the Muslim Ummah, that people have to take care of it. But they are interpreting the evidence differently, the scriptural evidence and the empirical evidence. Now, you may ask, okay, Justin, that's interesting. It's nice that they wrote lots of stuff about the plague. What did people actually do? Like, what did they do when epidemic disease happened? Okay, so if we go to the histories and we read, then we find that people did a number of things. Some people run away from the plague. Some people go and pray. They come together outside of the cities and they pray together. Some people go to the mosques, right? They do the same things that they do for other natural disasters, like drought when it does not rain, and istiqsa, you have to ask for rain from God. These are things, so you behave like a natural disaster like that. We also know that Muslims did take care of each other. This was probably what Ibn al-Khatib would say, don't do that, because that means you're going to get infected if you stay close to people. But many people did, like Ibn Lub said, or Ibn Ajiba, and other people also said this. So they did a whole range of different things. Ultimately, today we talk about the quarantine, right? Al-Hajar as-Sihi, as I say in Arabic, right? The notion of putting in a quarantine between people. Now, the quarantine originally in Europe was not for sick people. It was for healthy people. You would have people would arrive in a place. You didn't know if they were sick or healthy, and so you put them aside for 40 days until you saw if they stayed healthy or not. Okay. This was something that was not used in the Muslim world until maybe the late 18th century. In the early 19th century, we begin to find examples of this. We already have public health measures being used by the Ottoman Empire in the 16th century, but the quarantine doesn't appear until the 18th or the 19th century. And then when it does appear in the Muslim world, it also gets used by the Europeans during a colonial sense to control the Hajj and to control a population. So the quarantine and public health is always political and it has a political impact. And I think we all appreciate that now in the era of COVID. What decisions you make about how populations can move has a political question. Here, for example, where I am in Abu Dhabi, during COVID, the government said nobody can go out into public spaces and everybody has to wear a mask and get tested, et cetera, et cetera. But 1 hour away from here in Dubai, the government said almost the opposite. No, everybody can go out, everybody can be together, because they needed tourism. They needed economic development. They had to have people come together. This is a political question. And you can, and so this is also the truth when we look to history and how quarantines are being used. How did Muslims respond to COVID? everything I've been saying about contagion and infection and plague became relevant here. Because throughout the Islamic world, we had many fatwas, many fatawa over the last 3 years, over 150 fatwas about the issue of this. And what you will find is that many of the same things we've talked about, Omar, Itzah, this question of not going into a country, out of a country, that this hadith is cited a great deal, the other hadith about running away from a leper, the hadith about these are cited, and the legal opinions are cited to support the view that COVID is infectious and that people need to stay away. This was especially true during the first year of COVID, before we had the vaccines, right? So we see here that Islamic law was flexible, that it changed. Well, we do find, for example, though, that in these fatwas, people do not cite the la adwa, the hadith. This is not found in the contemporary fatwas because it is not in accordance with how people now understand it. I think Muslim scholars think it would be confusing for the population because its initial reason that it was there was to tell people that things do not happen without God's will. That was the original justification and understanding of why that hadith existed. So in the fatwas, we get a kind of a selective citation of evidence that supports contemporary understandings of disease and governmental policy. And I think that makes sense. That's actually in line with previous Muslim decisions of Muslim jurisprudence in the pre-modern period as well. So just to conclude, so we have time to talk briefly. What do we learn about Muslim understandings of plague, contagion, and so forth in these responses? We learn that religions are flexible, that new understandings of empirical evidence lead people to revisit legal ideas, and that this is what I think, again, as Dr. Noor said, this is the surface structure. This changes in accordance with the underlying principles that are found in the scriptural sources. But you can interpret those scriptural sources through changing empirical understandings and medical understandings, which help you understand the scriptural sources in a different light. So religion then is an engagement between a community and a tradition. And the tradition changes through that engagement, and the community is shaped by the tradition itself. It's a dialectic. Then that's how people. That's one way in which I guess the current pandemic helps us understand religion better. Okay, I think I'm going to stop there because I'm very curious if you have any questions or if I have been at all clear. So
okay, thank you for your explanation. That's religion is flexible, yeah. Okay. Mm-hmm. So we are going to Q&A section. So for you all, if you have any question for Professor Justin, you can leave your question with text in chat box, or you can raise your hand. And you can also leave your question with English or maybe in Bahasa Indonesia. Thank you. Bagi teman-teman yang mau bertanya, silakan. Boleh raise hand atau boleh ditulis di room chat ya.
I was very clear. No one has any questions.
Okay, I think we have our first question from Anfasya. Okay, Anfasya, let me know about your question. Thank you.
Hello, am I audible right now?
Yes.
Okay.
It was a really interesting explanation about the plague. I mean, like, as a Muslim, I've just known about that science that we have experienced 3 plagues during the previous centuries. But my question is, we've already experienced like for about 3 parts in the different centuries. The first one we got lepers, and then there were some plague too. But my question is, why is it difficult to imply that experience to be the solution of this COVID-19? I mean, during this COVID, as I read from WHO, that there are more than 700 million cases around the world. Also, there are 6 million deaths around the world. I mean, why is it difficult to to find the solution after experiencing that plague in the previous time to prevent all these cases, to prevent all the
I'm afraid you're breaking up a little bit. Am I breaking up? Hello? Am I back? Hello? Did I lose Anfasia? Okay. I think I will try to answer the question as best I understood the question. And then we'll see if he can come back at some point. Let me see. So I think the question was in general, if I understood it, since we had a plague before. Okay, Anfasia, I'm sorry I lost you. I'm going to try to answer your question though. So if we've had the plague before and we had all of these deaths, then why are we having that again now? Is that your basic question? Why are we not able to better deal with a new pandemic?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, well, the answer is we did not deal with it well before, right? I mean, we did not deal well with epidemic disease. Only in the 19th century have we begun to understand the vectors, like how does epidemic disease actually work? How is it transmitted? And you'll see, but what is interesting here is that there are imperatives. Like on the one hand, we have a medical imperative. Ideally, you would keep everybody healthy if they stayed inside their house and nobody went out. But if everybody stays inside their house, the economy crashes. And then people die of starvation. So when we look in the pre-modern period at, for example, I'm thinking here also of the Catholic Kingdom of Spain in the 16th century, where we have very good documentation. And we see that the king has the same problem. He's like, I want to put everybody in quarantine, but if I put them in quarantine, then the farmers won't be able to bring in the food from the countryside to the city, and there won't be any food. The farmers will die because nobody is buying their grain. The people in the cities won't have anything to eat. And so there is this tension between economy and health, and the health is part of the economy. So I think we've all seen how different countries in different parts of the world dealt with COVID very differently. In this way, in Abu Dhabi, it was a total lockdown. In my country of the United States, it was, and in China, a total lockdown in China, right? Complete lockdown for almost 3 years. They really just locked everything down. But over time, and in some places like New Zealand, very fortunate, very isolated, stopped people coming in, and it worked out very well for them in many ways, but until they were able to vaccinate people. The difference is, of course, today is vaccination. So ultimately, we were able to get people vaccinated, and that lowered the number of people who died. You know, the great flu epidemic of 100 years ago from 1919, you said 6 million people have died of COVID now. Well, 20 million people died of the flu then. The vaccine that we have now has helped us a great deal, but it is very difficult to deal from a public health perspective with pandemic diseases like this. We are fortunate that we have modern medicine and that we were able to develop these vaccines, which people are still dying. Hundreds of people are still dying, you know, almost every day around the, well, more than 100, but I would say probably more than 1,000 people are still dying every day around the world due to COVID. It's an ongoing problem, but we have this difficulty of balancing the economy and the need to move people and goods around and people's health. And I think all of us have different, some people want to live their lives as if everything were normal. Other people are very scared of getting sick and want to stay inside. And so each one of us is going to have to find that balance. The governments of today are not doing a better job than the governments of previous centuries.
Okay, thank you. There is any feedback from Pasha, maybe?
It was really clear, and thank you so much for the answer, sir.
Thank you for the question.
Okay, thank you, Pasha. Or maybe the other question. Bagi teman-teman yang mau bertanya, silakan boleh menggunakan bahasa Inggris ya maupun bahasa Indonesia. Teman-teman juga boleh menggunakan audio maupun bisa ditulis di kolom chat. Monggo bagi yang mau bertanya. Okay, no question. Okay, it is second question in the chat box, Prof. Hello, my name is Martina. I want to ask about is there any special curriculum at school in Middle East country about the story of the plague? Because it's connect with how the memories of the plague delivered to young generation. Thank you.
That's a very good question, and I wish that there were more. I don't think that there is very much on this. I think part of the problem is what we might call apologetic. When we look at the history of medicine and the history of science in the Muslim world today, in the Middle East, I don't know about Indonesia, but I know here in the Middle East, then there is people that Muslims then knew what we know now, that in Islam, there was knowledge of what was to come. And that's not, it's not true. I mean, this previous generations did not know about the disease that we understand today. Bacteria were discovered in the 19th century, and this is new knowledge. So the previous generations did not know these things. But they were able to do many, many things about, as we've talked about in terms of separating populations, in terms of also helping each other, in terms of having different arguments about these issues. A lot of this material is not taught in schools today. We teach it here at the university in Abu Dhabi, but it's not done at high school level. It's done at university, and it's only done by a few people. So it's I'm afraid that many people don't learn anything at all about these questions. I don't know what young people are like in Indonesia, but I know that young people here in most of the world are not very interested in things that happened hundreds of years ago. They're very interested in things that are happening right now. And of course, I think that's a problem. I think that we need to know more about the past in order to better understand the contemporary, the present. But, as a teacher, that is a pedagogical struggle. It is part of our job as teachers to be able to explain the significance of the past and of the past debates and discussions so that people today find them interesting and important.
Okay, thank you, Justin. Maybe from Martina, there is feedback. And maybe I just want to give a feedback from the answer for Professor Justin. We have same problem about the young people. I think in Indonesia we also know it's no the young people is not interested to study about history. It's just small of the population of young people. Okay, thank you. Maybe there is another question.
Well, while we wait for another question, let me just say, I think that one of the problems is that the way in which we talk about religion often seems like it's something that is static, that you just have to learn a certain number of texts and then you know religion. But this is not religion. Religion is an interaction between a community and a series of principles, right? That's why it's flexible. It's flexible because it changes. If you're going to have something that is stable, fi kulli makan wa zaman, as Dr. Noor said, if you're going to have something like that, it has to be able to change with the changing circumstances. And I think that if young people understand religion as a dynamic thing, as something that you base on principles of interaction and interpretation and in accordance with ethical values, what we call in Arabic the maqasid al-sharia, or a maslaha. If you understand that, then I think that the religious past and the way that you interact with it means it's not something that happens to you, It's something that you are part of, in which you create. And maybe that could make it a little more interesting. I don't know.
Yeah. Maybe I think our discussion will alive if one of you there is some argument about this discussion. So let's speak up. Let's speak up about our theme today.
If I may give any feedback about the second opinion that Professor Justin said last time, I agree with that, sir. I mean, like, makan zaman, it's going to be more interesting if we understand religion is not basically in only what we see. I mean, like, we have to have like this religion stuff has developed. I mean, how to say it in English? It's kind of confusing. Follow the development of the era itself. And the more people, the more the young, especially because some of us last time mentioned that the young does not really have that interest to the history. I think it's going to be our responsibility who interested in history right now. We have the responsibility to tell to the people, tell the people around us that history is really important to understand, to learn, and yeah, I think that's all. I'm sorry if it's like it's very difficult to be understood. Yeah.
No, thank you. I mean, I obviously I agree with you, at least in the sense that I know that where I am, and then also in the United States, that there is a crisis in the humanities, meaning that most young people don't find history, literature interesting. They want to study economics, they want to study sociology, they want to study politics, they want to study things that will give them jobs when they graduate, and they don't think that studying humanities will help them with that. But the issue is, if we don't understand the humanities, if we don't understand history, if we don't understand religion, if we don't understand literature, then we don't know what to do once we have a job. Then we don't understand how the society works, and we don't understand what meaning comes from. We don't understand how to create art. We don't understand how to create ethical communities as well, right? Now, so that should be part of the education. Part of our education. I don't mean it's not like everyone has to study history, but a little bit of thinking about the past and thinking about how religions change. I think this is vital. This is important to all educational systems. So I very much, I have to say, the number of people who are here listening to me is a lot more than I normally get. So I find that very positive. I think that's a very good sign that people are interested in this, just because they are interested in an opportunity to talk about how Muslim communities in the past understood contagion and understood pandemics and epidemics and how that relates to them today. This is a good conversation to have. And again, it makes me very happy that you invited me into it.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Justin and Fasya. Bagi teman-teman semuanya yang mungkin ingin diskusi dengan Profesor Justin menggunakan bahasa, tapi tidak kesulitan dengan bahasa Inggris, silahkan teman-teman bisa menyampaikannya dengan bahasa Indonesia. Nanti kami bantu untuk mentranslatekan gitu ya. So, and Fasya, there is any feedback?
Nothing yet, but like everything I agree with Professor Justin right now. I mean, it was really. I wasn't expected that, yeah, that was going to be really interesting because, as you said, that I was the one person that was not really interested in history. But once I got here, once I know that, wow, we can actually learn from the history, from the previous centuries. we can actually learn more from past, and then we can actually apply that in the future. I think it's not only in the flag stuff, but also in everything, education, politics, and things. I think we can really apply that in the future, and think, yeah, like that. So there's no more feedback. I think just, yeah, that's all. Waiting, probably others if anyone have a.
Thank you, Mr. Al-Pasha, and we still have 2 minutes for our discussion. Maybe there is one of you will ask something, or maybe give some statement for the explanation from Professor Justin. Let's speak up. But if you don't have any question or maybe feedback for explanation from Professor Justin, I think we will go to the end of our discussion today. But saya tawarkan lagi. Okay, there is one question in chat book. Okay, from Martina, I will ask about the medicine in the Middle East. In Indonesia, the medicine we have in alternative is like medicine. We use that when COVID-19 in Indonesia. And how about in the Middle East or face the pandemic? There are like something alternative medicine or like that, or how like that? Thank you.
Yes, thank you for that question. I don't actually know the answer to that. That is to say that in Abu Dhabi, where I live, the government is so strong. It has such a strong control over its population that everyone has had to get multiple vaccinations. It's not an option not to get vaccinations. Now things are better. Now that everybody's been vaccinated, the restrictions, people can go wherever they want and do whatever they want. And it's been that way for about a year now. But before that, it was very regulated. In that kind of scenario, alternative medicines and other ways of thinking about health don't have as much space to circulate, I think, as they might. I know that in America, where I go back to when I travel, that alternative medicines have been pretty widely spread. I mean, all sorts of things, many things that I don't think were very smart. People have tried. Well, in the Middle East, I don't know. I don't know. I haven't heard of too many alternative medicines. Of course, that have been used in this case. Of course, there is a very long sort of history of popular medicine, or sometimes that is overlaying with a little bit of people. I mean, obviously, okay, let me back up and rethink that. One clear thing that Muslims do the world over is not really part of modern clinical medicine is they use spiritual methods to deal with sickness. So you pray. Prayer is very important. Prayer has an important psychological effect. Prayer, one of the chief challenges that we had during COVID was psychological. We were not able to see our friends. We were not able to see our family. We were not able to go out. We were not able to get together, to have concerts, to go to soccer games, to whatever. We were not able to do these things. Psychologically, this was very difficult, especially for a lot of young people who were going through school and weren't able to see their friends or whatnot like this. In times of this, other methods like spiritual methods, like focusing on ways to calm yourself and to achieve a greater sense of well-being internally, if we consider that alternative medicine, perhaps, I don't know, but that's certainly valuable in such a scenario.
Okay, thank you, Professor Justin. There is one of you want to ask another question, maybe? We still have 1 minute for Q&A session.
If I can ask another question, may I? I just wondering actually. Because from Miss Martina last time she related with the health and also the education. I have one thing that is really stuck in my mind because lots of people, I mean, like lots of people that some of people that I meet, they believe in this thing. You, sir, who have already studied, experienced in this thing, what do you think about conspiracy? Is it really true? I mean, like, some people think that COVID is made by the people, China and things, and also there's someone who arranged that. But what do you think about conspiracy? If is it true, it means that, yeah, or is it false? Then if it's false, we need to fix it to all people who believe in this conspiracy thing, because I think it is really bad if it's false. That. Thank you, sir.
I think one thing that I think is striking about pandemics and epidemics is that they often create a sense of fear. We lose control. We don't know whom to trust anymore. Many people stop trusting the government. Many people don't trust each other. Some people hide their sickness from other people. Other people aren't sure if they should go around. Historically, see, history, historically, when we look in the past, we see that often minorities get blamed, right? So that, for example, in Europe, sometimes people blamed the Jews for the Black Death. In America today, people blamed Chinese people for COVID, and there were attacks where people would attack people from China and from other places and against them because they're afraid, and so they take their biases and their discrimination that they already have, and they put them onto the thing that they're afraid of. And this also is where conspiracies come from. I don't believe in any of the conspiracies about COVID. In America, they talked about cell phone towers and they talked about lab leaks and this and all of these other things. And honestly, I don't think it's that important where the disease came from. What's important is that we figure out a way in which we can live with each other and trust each other and help each other not to get sick and not to die. In that way, you know, this involves a sense of collectivity. We have to put the collective good above the individual. My country, the United States of America, is very bad at that, very bad. We have a culture of the individual, not the collective. But there are other places where people do place the collective above the individual good. And that means that you say, okay, I am going to lose some of my personal freedoms in order to make sure everybody can stay healthier and safer as possible. But it's not always that straightforward. It's hard. So I think it's because it's a hard problem and because it's difficult to solve that people have conspiracies. Conspiracies give a sense of control. If you have a conspiracy idea, you feel like, aha, I understand why this is happening. There's this logic. Only I and my friends, we understand, but we know. And I think that sense of control that comes with that gives people power when they're afraid. So I don't believe in them, but I understand why they're there. They're there because people are afraid.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Justin and Masha. And we are going to the last question, sir, from Mr. Latif. There is any collective memory in Middle East, or maybe something like mythology to face or to avoid the pandemic like that? Thank you, sir.
I mean, I think that the closest thing to collective memory has to do with this interaction with various hadith and various aspects of religious tradition, because that's what people remember. And that comes like when you look at the fatwa, and we had a visit here from the Wizarat al-Awqaf in Abu Dhabi, and when people talk, then you go back to what you remember, what you've heard stories about, and what is present in the religious stories. But there's no collective mythology that I would know of regarding epidemic disease. It's been a little bit too long since we've had such a large pandemic in the Middle East more generally. So nothing that I'm aware of. But that's an interesting question. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Professor. And there is any feedback for Mr. Raden, maybe? Okay, thank you. And I think it's very interesting discussion, but we have time, not much time to discuss about it. And I think we have no more question about, for this discussion. So before we close, I please Professor Justin to give some closing statement maybe for today.
Well, I would like to just, but to end by thanking everyone for the invitation again. I'd like to thank Professor Noor Huda for his kind introduction, of which I understood a very little bit, but I took some pictures of the slides, so I'm going to go use Google Translate so I can understand more. And it's just really wonderful to have such interest from students such as yourselves and to be invited to be part of this conversation. And so I'm very grateful. And I wish you, of course, I wish you best of luck in all of your studies, and hope that you continue to be interested in history. Yes, Anfasya, you need to continue to stay interested in history. Okay.
Yes, sir. Ready, sir.
Okay,
Okay.
thank you, Professor.
Thank you all.
Again, thank you, Pak Noor Huda. Thank you, Pak Latif and the other audience for our discussion today. And that's very awesome. And now we reach at the end of discussion. And I do apologize for every single mistake that I made. Come a moderator for our discussion today.
You did a wonderful job. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. After everyone, and see you for next discussion. My name is Raden and Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.